Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to Primetime. Primetime celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff, and is a collaboration between the Friends of the Bethel Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus. Thanks for joining us. If you miss any presentations or would like to see past events, they are archived in the Bethel Digital Library. Join us on Thursday, April 4, when children's book author Melina Mungol presents Community and the Environment, the Power of Picture Books. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Dan Ritchie, Professor of English Emeritus. Dan taught at Bethel for over 35 years. He was an extremely active faculty member, a superb teacher, scholar, and colleague who founded the humanities program and defended the liberal arts. I think no one is surprised that his scholarship has continued and at a high level since his retirement from teaching. Today he will discuss his recent article entitled, "Was Homer Ahead of His Time?" Let's welcome Dan.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have an opening question. I want to make sure if I'm in the right place. Is this the talk on Homer Simpson?
He is definitely ahead of his time. So the article just came out in National Affairs digitally last week. Paper copies probably in mid-April. Barnes & Noble usually sells it. And they gave it a new title, as Great Art Ahead of Its Time. The editors do good things with my work, so I'm sure this will help. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your coming out. It's wonderful to be with colleagues, former colleagues, and students, especially students who'll be graduating or students that I taught at the very end of my career. And over those 40 years of teaching, I often read articles or heard talks on Chaucer, Milton, Swift, or some other great author that dealt with race, class, gender, or something related. And sometimes the scholar would conclude, somewhat to his surprise, that the old guy was ahead of his time. Perhaps the scholar had seriously looked into Swift's critique of empire in Gulliver's Travels, or discovered more about Chaucer's sympathy for the wife of Bath. 350 years after Milton's death, his portrayal of the mutuality between husband and wife sometimes comes as a surprise to scholars, although that mutuality was well known and appreciated by women in the 1700s. When students wrote such things, my marginal note was something like this: perhaps they were ahead of their time. But perhaps we don't really understand their time very well. What we do know is that they were popular in their time or shortly thereafter. But set aside whether they were ahead of their time, what questions do they provoke for our time? At a conference, I was describing similar anecdotes to a colleague, and I asked a different question. If these writers, so central to the formation of Western culture, were ahead of their time, who are the folks who fashioned the oppressive Western culture from which the conference speakers are seeking to liberate us? Who are the bad guys? And then I joked that Homer must have been ahead of his time, since Penelope outfoxes Odysseus near the end of the Odyssey. A woman! She confirms Odysseus's identity by tricking that wily strategist into revealing the secret of their bed's location, something only Odysseus could have known. Not to concede the point, he responded, "Well, apparently Homer was ahead of his time." Now, I studied Homeric Greek in college. Here's my Homeric dictionary, not very successfully, but enough to respect the philologists and archaeologists who've helped us understand the Bronze Age in which the poems are set and Homer's own age. And I would never offer an original opinion about their cultures. But of course, all that was irrelevant to my colleague. All that mattered was classifying Homer according to his notions of progress. And that classification procedure, of course, is regularly applied to Chaucer, Jane Austen, Dickens, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, every other significant author. How closely do their insights and values match ours? And if they do, they must have been ahead of their time. And even better, when they anticipate a future even more progressive culture, a future, of course, that the critic desires. Well, the older critique of this approach was to call it the Whig interpretation of history. Today, many label it as woke, but all such phrases foreclose conversation. So I'll call it progressive historicism. I hope that's fairly neutral, and try to open up what's behind it. Ironically, the very innocence of the remark that an author is ahead of his or her time suggests an alternative approach, and here's why. The remark indicates a capacity for surprise. The speaker is surprised that this author has risen above his negative expectations. And an openness to surprise is a powerful antidote to this trend. For if Homer, Dante, Emily Dickinson, George Eliot, and Frost, and all the rest are ahead of their time, who exactly is left to blame for the alleged structural oppression of the societies they helped shape? If someone is continually surprised at how contemporary these central figures remain, perhaps he'll realize that he's been asking the wrong questions. Someone who expresses surprise can also stop and listen. And after listening comes true learning if one is ready to receive something new. And that three-part approach, stopping, listening, and receiving, is where I'll ultimately be going. But first, 4 criticisms of progressive historicism, then my alternative. Consciously or not, the progressive historicist sees the historic narrative as one of progress and liberation from the past. It thereby injures our view of past authors and their relevance for today. Second, it also injures the way new historical novels, films, TV series represent the past. And I'm going to skip that part of the article and greatly shorten the third problem. The third is that it turns education into a technique, a system of classifying great works by their position along a supposed arc of history. Fourth, and most damaging, it injures our view of human nature. It replaces human beings as creatures and treats us as processes formed by historical forces in the journey to liberation. And yet, for all my criticism, I see this tendency more as a heresy than an error. Heresies take a partial truth and emphasize it out of all reasonable proportion. But along the way, they raise significant questions about theology or history or art or literature or gender or race. Everyone should stop, listen, and receive those questions. Well, the colleague who observed that Homer was ahead of his time might accept some of these observations. I'm sure, though, that he would point out that, after all, society does change, and don't artists have a responsibility for that? And certainly they do. When Plato exiles the poets from his ideal city, he holds out hope for their return if they can show how they benefit the polis. And you can read Aristotle's Poetics as his response. Works of art benefit society if they refine the proper objects of our social compassion, our pity, or the proper objects of our horrified rejection, our terror. Those are the works worth supporting. It's completely different, however, to praise an author for anticipating the cultural values of our own day or some utopian era, because that assumes the critic already knows what habits of the heart and mind are needed for social flourishing. By contrast, Aristotle's ideal playgoer actually needs to learn something from Oedipus or the Oresteia. The progressive's second assumption is that the social role of art is to uncover the oppressive cultural regime of the past and replace it with stories of resistance and liberation. And in the process, the splendid multi-layered work of great authors, even if they are talking about resistance and liberation, becomes flattened into a single dimension. There are no more enduring questions, no more troubling, fruitful, or beautiful implications that await future interpretation. It's oppression and liberation all the way down. And this second implication has still more troubling implications. For the progressive's analysis may not be liberating at all. The practices he or she assumes to be virtuous may be vicious. And the treatment of Jane Austen can illustrate this problem. Austen's works now are as popular as they have ever been. They're regularly turned into films, plays, adaptations. But feminist scholars, especially since the 80s, are divided about her work. All of Austen's novels end in a marriage that promises to be happy, and that is a problem. In her immensely influential book, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir taught feminists to see marriage in opposition to furthering a woman's personal development. These are exact quotes. She could only countenance marriage as a provisional association that could be ended at will and must remain open to other sexual liaisons with men and women. A woman must further be liberated from the need to bring her unborn children to term, and she must be freed from any that she chooses to bear from marrying their father. Finally, she must have a well-paying job to free her from the vassalage of a husband's financial support. Only then can marriage find a place in Beauvoir's vision of women's equality and self-development. Well, you might say that middle-class American and European women are living the dream. The percentage of Americans aged 25 to 50 who live with their spouse and at least one child has dropped from 67% in 1970 to 37%. Out-of-wedlock births have risen from about 5% in 1960 to 40% today. Well, have these changes and their accompanying social structures resulted in liberation? 25% of single women are living in poverty, that's 2018 figures, compared with less than 5% in married couples. And children are faring much worse in such homes. Even the New York Times is finally willing to print what many have been saying for decades. The children from married couples are overwhelmingly better off, even better off than children whose single parent is well paid. They have better educational outcomes, better outcomes for nutrition, behavioral stability, and future income possibilities. Not surprisingly, declining marriage rates have been especially harmful for Black families, though married Black couples are doing well if they buck the trend and establish a two-parent married household. Black couples earn a median income of about $105,000 per year in 2017. Not bad. Not as much as a white couple, 127, far less than Asian Americans, about 150,000. But who would scoff at a median income of 100,000? And of course, the social class most exposed to Beauvoir's view, namely college-educated people, pay the least attention to them. Our marriages are doing pretty darn well. It's the cultural strata that is uneducated that reflects her views. Less educated Americans are suffering. Well, my points here are simple. In practice, ignoring Beauvoir actually looks like liberation, and following her looks like structural social injustice, to use more recent language. And if your reading of Jane Austen is framed by the ideas that she popularized, you may classify her correctly according to whether she's ahead of her time. But the novel's rich psychological, social, emotional, and even religious conversation about men and women in love becomes irrelevant. In their agenda-setting book, A Feminist Literary Criticism, The Mad Woman in the Attic, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar quote from The Second Sex often, and they allude to this famous claim. This is by Beauvoir. Woman is defined and differentiated with respect to man, and not he with reference to her. She is the incidental, the inessential. Man is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. For Gilbert and Gubar in this book, Austen's heroines are admirable precisely because early in the novels, they promise to reject this definition. Early on, they see themselves as the subject. Quote, Austen never renounces the subjectivity of what her heroines term their own madness until the end of each of their stories, unquote. But ending with a marriage is a problem. And so Gilbert and Gubar return to the characters to find a madness that will link them theoretically with Bertha Mason, the actual mad woman in the attic from Jane Eyre. Austen's characters were ahead of their time, apparently, until their psychological and social development results in a marriage at the climax. Still, I agree with their next claim, which is that the relation between personal identity and social role is so problematic that the emerging self in Austen can only survive with a sustained double vision. This double vision between personal identity and social role is degrading for them. But why? Surely that double vision is required of all of us at times, our personal lives, our social lives. Well, it's problematic for them because it terminates the characters' affirmation of their own subjectivity and madness, which they illustrate this downfall in the heroines who marry at the end of Emma, Pride and Prejudice, and Sense and Sensibility. Here's a quote. "The mortifications of Emma, Elizabeth, and Marianne are necessary accompaniments to the surrender of self-responsibility and self-definition. Marianne Brandon, Elizabeth Darcy, and Emma Knightley, their married names, never exist except in the slightly malevolent futurity of all happily ever afters." But in literature, as in life, mortification at one's deeds often spurs us to change our character and to accept responsibility. Mortification causes us to grow up. Moreover, if matrimony is the origin of change, as Austen says barely 2 pages into Emma, presumably that narrator thinks that all characters will change in unanticipated ways after marriage. And why should a happy marriage malevolently prevent one's future from holding that same mixture of happiness and sorrow that we experienced in the past? Well, the criticism of Gilbert and Gubar and their many allies implies that Austen's heroines should simply affirm their adolescent impulses and retain them unchanged into adulthood. Good news, students. Perhaps then Marianne Dashwood could have gone insane like Bertha Mason and achieved an attic of her own. But if we set all this aside and actually read Sense and Sensibility, we can join Austen's exploration of the mind of Marianne Dashwood as Austen describes her acceptance of the steady affection of the much older Colonel Brandon. Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions and to counteract by her conduct her most famous maxims. Now, the reader knows that Marianne Dashwood was not born to an extraordinary fate. He knows that all mature adults go through a process similar to what she endured. And yet, Austen attracts us to Marianne because her tone invites us to allow Marianne the right to consider her fate as extraordinary. Austen's complex tone continues gently bringing Marianne through her psychological recovery to a mature sexual relationship, which is marriage to Colonel Brandon. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion for Willoughby, I'm assuming Hugh Grant is the bad guy in this movie, as she once fondly flattered herself with expecting, Marianne found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. Well, marriage particularly oppresses a woman, writes Beauvoir, by freeing her from any participation in collective life. But this makes sense only if collective life is described as wage labor plus politics. And in her highly conventional Marxist understanding, that's what Beauvoir thinks. I mean, she follows Marx very closely and explicitly. But after her marriage, Marianne will be intimately involved in the social and economic life of her village. The responsibilities of Emma and of Elizabeth Bennet will be similar. And at the end of Persuasion, Anne Elliot will join the sorority of naval wives who are incessantly occupied with the intrusion of public affairs upon the lives of military families. In short, everything in Austen's novels prepare her women for their individual and their collective lives as adults. And a true historical criticism, including a feminist criticism, could take into account all of these elements. And unless one is in the grip of an ideology that classifies Austen's characters according to whether they're sufficiently ahead of their time, it's frankly hard to see how readers can predict a passive or a socially uninvolved future for them, still less a malevolent one. Well, I'm going to cut the second section of my article that talks about historical films and plays at the Guthrie and the Royal Shakespeare Company, how they distort the past as well. And I'm going to move to the section on education, and I'm going to make this quite brief. The influence of a progressive historicism on education probably affects more people than anything else. Consider these two passages from an AP history text that I use at Cristo Rey when I go down there to help out a little bit, if I can avoid throwing the book across the room. Enlightenment thinkers sought universal, objective knowledge that did not reflect any particular religion, political view, class, gender, or culture. They ignored the extent to which European upper-class male perspectives colored their, quote, objective knowledge. And then a few pages later, John Locke claimed that man was born with a mind that was a clean slate, and that he acquired all his ideas through experience. Experience plus reflection, little pedantic footnote. Locke stressed that cultural differences were the result not of unequal natural abilities, but of unequal opportunities to develop one's abilities. Smith remarked that there was little difference other than education between a philosopher and a street porter. Both were born, he claimed, with the ability to reason, and both should be free to rise in society according to their talents. Okay? 3 pages apart. Now, imagine I'm sitting with Megan, who's of Hispanic and African-American heritage, and she writes this in her AP essay. This is an imagined essay. Many Americans have held to Enlightenment beliefs, that people are equal regardless of race and gender. They should be free to develop their talents. But these beliefs reflect an European upper-class male perspective. They're not really true. Megan's claims sound astounding. You may consider her confused, but although her rejection of human equality is not what the AP graders want, she has legitimately based her claims on her AP textbook. She has classified the Enlightenment as her textbook wished. The confusion doesn't lie with her. It lies in the book's insistence on classifying the works of Locke and Smith and many others by the rubric of progressive historicism. And that rubric dominates the entire textbook. The fourth error is more serious yet. It shifts our assumptions about human nature, our views about the human condition, away from our flawed human nature or the virtues that we need to flourish as individuals and communities. Instead, human beings are merely the sum of historical processes. Paulo Freire is probably the most important pedagogical voice for this view, but his source is Marx's brilliant manuscripts of 1844. And in those, Marx defines man as a species being, a phrase I wondered about for decades. That's really the only new idea I have in this article, is this one. This is not just a version of Aristotle's insight that human beings are political animals. No, it rests on a far more comprehensive anthropology, namely that we only become human through particular social processes. And for Marx, that's material production. Becoming human is comprehensively social. Apart from it, the individual does not rise to the notice of Marx or of any other critical theorist. That's what critical theory assumed. We're not first created as individuals in God's image, nor does our humanity reside in the pursuit of reason and virtue. Marx thought all such conceptions were purely theoretical. Instead, the essence of man, he writes in one of the theses on Feuerbach, is the ensemble of social relations. The essence of man can therefore be understood only as a species. And we become fully human, fully liberated, only when we understand the social process as the critical theorist does. This approach is crucial to all subsequent critical theory. And it's one reason why all intersectional critiques of the past and hopes for the future have a similar structure. It doesn't matter whether they're based on class, economics, race, the environment, or gender. The critique always locates an original sin that prevents our social development. For Marx, it's the division of labor and private property. But it could be patriarchy, environmental degradation, heteronormativity, racism, colonialism, or some intersectional combination of them all. Your consciousness is then liberated by understanding these social dynamics, Marx writes, and by shaping your life to the, quote, practical overthrow of social relations. That's the German ideology. That's one reason the critical theorist needs disciples who will follow his or her ideas, rather than students who will join us in a mutual inquiry. So what's wrong with pointing out evil and hoping for a better future? Nothing, of course. That's the partial truth that this heresy contains. I'm with Samuel Johnson when he says that whether a writer wishes to be useful or pleasing, the first requisite is the religious and moral knowledge of right and wrong. But Johnson is aware that great literature is often at war with itself. The purpose of literature, he writes, is pleasure. And pleasurable literature does not always teach us the religious and moral knowledge of right and wrong. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Johnson's analysis of Falstaff and his interaction with Prince Hal. But Falstaff, unimitated, inimitable Falstaff, how shall I describe thee? Falstaff is the one with the pillow in his shirt. And Prince Hal is the one with the stick that's supposed to be a sword. It was a great production. Thou compound of sense and vice, of sense, which may be admired but not esteemed, of vice, which may be despised but hardly detested. Yet the man thus corrupt, thus despicable, makes himself necessary to the prince that despises him by that most pleasing of all qualities, perpetual gaiety. The moral to be drawn from this representation is that no man is more dangerous than he, with a will to corrupt, hath the power to please. And neither wit nor honesty ought to think themselves safe with such a companion when they see Henry seduced by Falstaff. Where is Matt? Okay, be careful of Falstaff. Samuel Johnson enters into the appeal of Falstaff, as have audiences over 4 centuries. But at the same time, Johnson holds strongly to his religious and moral beliefs. But unlike the progressive historicist, his moral critique of Falstaff is balanced by his ability to receive the plays and delight in them. This ability is described by C.S. Lewis in a somewhat broader context. A work of whatever art can be received or used. When we receive it, we exert our senses and imagination according to a pattern invented by an artist. When we use it, we treat it as assistance for our own activities. So to recover a more humane culture, we must treat its creators as human beings, not as processes in the evolution of social liberation. We must stop using their creations to herald a future world and instead immerse ourselves in theirs. The first demand of any art that it makes upon us, continues Lewis, is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. So perfectly does Johnson do this that he seems to forget that Falstaff is a fictional character. It's as if he's observed Hal and Falstaff from a bench at the Boar's Head Tavern. You know, I don't really care if Shakespeare was ahead of his time, do you? After reading Johnson, after experiencing this, is that Kate in the background, who was Prince Hal even earlier? My greatest privilege was entering that world with these students. I invite you to come along. Thank you. So we have actually 20 minutes, 12:05. So we have plenty of time for, and I want to tell you, we do have prizes for. There are extra copies of the Norton Anthology of English Literature just waiting for anybody who will please take it off my hand. Susie Nelson keeps getting copies of the Norton Anthology. So back there, there's a little table. And if you want to read the full article, are there already copies? So we made about 10 copies of the full, very lengthy article for you if you'd like to see that. Okay, so, yes.
Speaking of the Norton Anthology, I noticed in teaching over many years that the footnotes change in the anthologies, both things that had to be explained that you wouldn't have thought had to be exchanged, like who Adam and Eve were, but also things with certain ideological emphases. So I'm wondering what, based on what you've laid out for us here, how do you see those kinds of attitudes happening in even things as simple as an anthology?
Okay, so Dan's question, this is Dan Taylor, who hired me in 1985. Sorry to move. Regret, yeah. Yeah, he's asking how even the footnotes in the Norton Anthology change, which they do, right? The selections, they do. I actually wrote an article about that for Books and Culture. Yes. It was called Speaking Power to Truth, as opposed to Speaking Truth to Power. Anyway, here's an example. In one edition of the Norton Anthology, they included Chaucer's Franklin's Tale. And the Franklin's Tale has a happy marriage at the end. And it says the most important question to ask in marriage is not who's the boss, which is what the wife of Bath and the clerk talk about. Instead, it's to ask who is the most frais, which means generous in Middle English. Who's the most generous? That's the best question you can ask in marriage. We can't have a selection that suggests a happy marriage in the Norton Anthology. That goes against everything the editors are doing. So they took it out, and you can see that bias. Now there's still a lot of great stuff in the Norton Anthology, and I really liked it. But I would mention the footnotes from time to time too. Good. Another question. Yes, Charlie?
So I have a question. Given the kind of historical progressivist view of past literature and past stories, do you think that they kind of fall to the error that their own view of history itself was the product of historical progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is the progressive historicist willing to acknowledge that his or her own view of the arc of history is itself historically conditioned? And the answer is no. In practice, they don't do this. And the reason Marx is so brilliant is he's the first one to point out that this is the key to liberation. And once you're liberated, you're liberated. Now, let's make it hard for ourselves. We think that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He is the ultimate liberation. But would we think that if we lived in Iraq? Muhammad is the latest prophet, and he absorbs everything behind him. Are Christians willing to acknowledge that there could be another Messiah? We shrink in horror at the very thought. So I do think Marx is, and many people pointed out the religious, parallels between Marxism and Christianity. But it's not a slam dunk criticism. Do the historians want to add anything? Chris? I don't see Anne-Marie anymore, but okay.
We talked about aversion. So one of my favorite historians is Tracy McKenzie. He teaches at Wheaton College. He's a historian of the American South, so he's accustomed to wrestling with slavery, right? But in a little book he did for University Press that we talked about in class the other day, he suggested that the joy of doing primary source work is you're not having a conversation about the past, you're in a conversation with the past. And so he suggested you need to use discernment, right? You have to think critically about sources. But he also starts with love. And the first thing you have to do is to approach them in a Christian spirit of loving your neighbor in the past, which among other things means you have to be open to learning from your neighbors in the past. And I think you'll probably agree with your criticism of progressive historicism.
Yeah.
So it's a common thing we cross with.
So Chris's comment was a colleague in Wheaton who recommends studying primary sources precisely because then you're in conversation with them and beginning with love, but also being critical of which primary sources you choose, which is the Norton Anthology. That's the issue. in selecting those pieces. And it's true for us in the humanities program. It's true for the selections that you choose in CWC as well. None of these is value free. To me, the brilliance of the books that we choose in humanities is that almost all of them are in dialogue with, and in some degree, conflict with themselves. And so the conversations that they create are endless. Certainly endless for each generation, but even frankly, as you get older, the books change over time. I would love to hear from Kate, or for any of you who acted in the Shakespeare, Brett and Matt, has the experience of being in Henry IV or Henry V, if you were in that, has it changed over time? Have you thought about it in new ways, or has it impacted your life in new ways?
Yeah, it directly has impacted my life. Before, I struggled with Shakespeare and how to understand. I doubted my ability to be able to understand what was being written, and having the opportunity to perform it, coming from loving theater but never fully trusting myself with Shakespeare, having it, performing it has just given me a deep love for it and the depths of the stories. And I just got to see Othello in the Shakespeare Globe in London, and like I'm just so grateful for the experience.
Well, I love that comment, because one of the things we want to do in CWC and humanities is to embolden students to enter into that conversation with the past. And also to realize there are many different ways of producing Othello and First Henry IV. I'm going to see it at the Guthrie. I'm dreading it. My wife won't sit with me. Good. Other comments, especially from students, and it doesn't have to be your experience with Shakespeare or with these plays. It can be with something else you've read in political science, philosophy, how you've entered into this conversation and it's changed over time. That's what I'm particularly interested in. How have you kept going back, Matt?
I think an author that stuck with me through the humanities program was Moltmann.
Moltmann, okay.
And like when we were in the class, like reading through Moltmann and talking about him, I had like a particular view on what he wrote, and I was like, I'm 100% like all for everything he says. And then like after the class, I was kind of thinking about it more, and I was like, okay, maybe I disagree with some things more, and it's kind of changed. And I've kind of gone back and forth, and I've been able to see how my perspective on what he wrote has like changed and developed over time, based on my own experience and also trying to apply, what he's written to my own life.
So I think we read just a chapter from The Crucified God does that sound right?
I think our class read Jesus for Today.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay, good. So, I mean, this week is the perfect week to be thinking about Moltmann, what the crucifixion means. And I'm reading theology right now that's making me, what happened on the cross? That's wonderful. Keep thinking about that and experiencing it in music and art and theology, all of these things. Yeah, Jim.
So when you were talking, it made me think about some of the struggles I sometimes have with apologetics. It's my joy to teach apologetics here, but I confess more than a little bit of frustration with a lot of the Christian works of apologetics, because in answering these objections or in arguing against atheists or non-Christians, whatever else, I find so many of their arguments to be just sloppy and not attending to the details of the argument. And so it seems to me like this isn't just what you're saying, but the point that you're making is that the simplistic critiques of works of literature and history don't deal with the nuances of the present and the moment, and treat the text as just something to be argued against
Right.
and then moved on.
Yeah.
Is that like always? Are we just sort of, whenever we're arguing against something because we feel so passionate about this underlying idea, are we as kind of fallen, clueless people, do we just get wrapped up in our passion for arguing? Is there a way to have any hope to not do that?
Do we always get wrapped up in our passion for arguing? There's some members of my family that would say yes. You know, it's to be a disinterested critic is very difficult, and I don't think it's possible. You know, there's a great critic called Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who says we all begin with a certain horizon, and when we approach works of art, we hope there can be a merging of horizons, but we always bring something to it. And the word that he uses is translated prejudice. We bring a prejudgment. I haven't mentioned Burke yet so here we go. So Burke recognizes this, that the French Enlightenment and their English apologists believed that we could have a view from nowhere, and it's impossible. However, we can be aware of it. We can be aware of our prejudices and make fun of them, which my family is also very good at doing, and achieve maybe a certain degree of humility. But no, I don't think beginning with a passionless approach is ever possible or necessarily even desirable. I mean, I did have to think about, Susan Gubar came to one of my graduate classes, and I had to think about this. And she asked in class, well, give me an example of a piece of literature that's not affected by gender. And so I'd just been memorizing a little bit of Milton, and it's about the moon rising in clouded majesty, and o'er the dark her peerless virtue shed, or something like that. Well, you see, the moon is imagined as a woman there. It's true. It's true. So being aware of the limits of your own passions and being open to others, I think that's the best we can hope for. I think it's the best we can hope for.
What would Kendi or a progressive historian say in rebuttal to your presentation today?
Well, that I haven't been liberated. I don't really understand. I'm treating human beings in this outmoded view as really. I do think Bethel in our Christian commitments, we have a huge resource. But it is also a presupposition that we're created in God's image, we're fallen. There's the Greek overlay of pursuit of virtue and reason, so that I think are essential to humanity as well. And so my own assumptions, I'm insufficiently aware of. People have been telling me this ever since college and before. If you just read this book, you'll see. If you just have this experience, you'll see. And I've read a lot of books. I've had a lot of experiences, including this Cristo Rey, and this is the best I can do. I'm still not seeing. The Catholics call it invincible ignorance. Buckley liked that phrase, invincible ignorance, and I've got it bad. Yes?
What would you say to someone that would perhaps believe that the Frankfurt School is the only school that adequately deals with the issue of justice?
I'd say they're totally wrong. Adorno and Horkheimer, I mean, they have a brilliant critique of Enlightenment, too. I mean, they see Nazism as kind of the outcome of Enlightenment. But first of all, they're almost unreadable. The prose is spectacularly bad, and I do think that's a problem. One of the things I like about Edward Said is it's clear. He's a clear writer. But I don't see who's been liberated by the Frankfurt School. Leszek Kolakowski's History of Marxist Thought, I think, is the great source for this. At one point during graduate school, I was reading Kolakowski's 3-volume History of Marxist Thought, big picture of Marx on the front. And I had a Milton Friedman t-shirt, the conservative economists, for my pajamas. And my wife said, "I'm not sleeping with Marx and Milton Friedman anymore. You've got to get something else." But I commend Kolakowski to you. He tries to make sense of it.
If you could summarize what you hope readers would take away from your article in one sentence, what would it be?
Stop, listen, receive. That's it. And that I think is what we try to do in many of the courses here. Our view of teaching, all the way back to Edgren, is that we are fellow learners with you. And the best kind of Bethel teaching does that. Stop, listen, receive. And then, of course, share, which has been, as teachers, it's our great joy to have shared these works and this time with you. It creates a real community. Regrettably only lasting 4 years for you, but longer for us.
Yeah, one of the issues that came up in this discussion is the question of liberation, and I've been very interested in that. But increasingly, what I'm coming to be aware of is that most of the time when people talk about liberation, they're talking about external liberation, like they want to be liberated from something external. But they tend to de-emphasize inner liberation. And reading Jonathan Edwards, his theory of affection, I was very surprised when in Humanities I read it. I thought it was quite interesting. I went online to check his biography, because what you see outside, most of the times, is a projection of what is inside. If I am somebody interested in money, you can teach me the whole book of Revelation, but I will turn the conversation into money making. Because that's my inner, if my inner desire is compassion, you can talk about everything, war or whatever, but you will see that in the conversation I still turn around. So that inner cultivation becomes something very, very important to me, because sometimes, and when I thought about studying humanities, one of the things that became fascinating to me is like, wow, sometimes I sit down and say, look at all this accumulated wisdom, but look at the kind of conversation sometimes we're having. So where did all this wisdom go to? So that issue of inner cultivation to me is very important.
It's a great question, and it reminds me of a story that, Samuel was saying one of the problems with discussions about liberation is that they are merely external, and they don't reflect a need for a reality of internal liberation. And he said nice things about Jonathan Edwards, which is terrific. There was a great anecdote by Robert Coles, the Harvard psychiatry professor, who really was brought up short by a student from a less well-to-do background, from a poor background, who was so mortified at the way her fellow Harvard students treated her. And her question was, what does all this mean? What does all this mean if we're still treating each other so poorly? And I don't know why anybody would go to Harvard after that, but apparently they still do. But it brings up this question for you as students and for us as teachers. What does this mean? How can it assume truly liberating status? Bethel is not a church. Bethel is an academic institution. But we live in that tension of this area of the kingdom that deals with everything in the world, everything seen in the light of Christ. So thank you all very much for coming, and it's been a great pleasure to be with you.